When we last met, we talked about Paul bringing these surprising special guests to Jerusalem, to the council there. He brings with him Barnabas, and he brings a Gentile Hellenistic convert, uncircumcised, by the name of Titus. Well, as you recall in that last message, they extend the right hand of fellowship to Titus. He does not need to be circumcised. They give the full blessings to Paul to go preach to the Gentiles. So we have Peter saying that his mission, his calling, is to the Hebrews, and Paul's mission and calling is to the Gentiles. Now, here in this passage today that we're going to be looking at, we find the most dramatic encounter and confrontation that we have in the New Testament. Two men who are mortal enemies. There's Peter. He is the fisherman from Galilee. He's a Hebrew. He's circumcised. And there's Saul, there's Paul, he's the persecutor, the destroyer of the church. He was a citizen of Rome. He's from Tarsus, one of the capital cities. He studied under the great Gamaliel in the Hebrew faith. So we find in the New Testament that the first half of the book of Acts is the story of Peter, and the second half of the story of Acts is the story of Paul. One is to the Hebrews and one is to the Gentiles. So in this confrontation now between these two great leaders, we find the only place in the New Testament where the apostles actually confront each other. One is the rock, Peter. The other is the destroyer of the church, the convert, Paul. And these two great leaders are going to have it out over the primary fundamental issue of the church so that they can be sure that there is this great breakthrough that Paul sees for the mission of the church. Now, the question that they're dealing with is this: is the gospel purely and only for the Jewish people, the Hebrews, and some converts, or is it for all people? Is it for the Gentiles all the way to Rome and to Spain? Is it for everybody or just for the Hebrew nation? And for 17 years, Peter and the apostles had only preached the gospel in the areas of the Hebrews, and they saw the gospel as for the God's chosen people in the Old Testament. It was only for the Jews, only for those who were circumcised. But now Paul comes along and he begs the question, is the gospel for the Jews or for all people, the Gentiles alike? And secondly, if it is for all people, are there any requirements? Do the Gentiles need to be circumcised as a sign of their belief, as the Judaizers are preaching in Galatia? They're struggling with this issue of, is there anything that must be added to the gospel or grace and faith in Jesus Christ? Now let me give you an example of areas that are added on to today, or questionable areas. Let's talk about baptism for a second. Baptism is the New Testament sign of Old Testament circumcision. When a child was 8 years old in the Old Testament in the Jewish faith, they would come to the priest and he would circumcise them. And that was a sign of what we call their membership in the visible community of God. I want you to understand that there's a visible community and an invisible community. And circumcision was a sign. Yes, you're received into our fellowship, into our body, but there's nothing that you do. You don't profess anything. You're too young to do that. But we circumcise you as a sign of membership, and we promise and commit ourselves that we will raise you and teach you and instruct you so that one day you can make your profession of faith. You'll reach an age of accountability where you'll have your bar mitzvah and you will make your own personal profession of faith in our God. And when you do that at that age of accountability, you're not only a member now of the visible community, but you're a member of the invisible community of believers, the spiritual body of believers. So at an age of accountability, when someone can understand their faith, the Hebrews made a profession of faith at their bar mitzvah. Now, baptism is a big issue in the church. We have a whole denomination that was created over this issue of the age and the manner of baptism. And the Roman Catholic Church believes in the sacrament of baptism and that it's a sacrament of regeneration through the word and through the water, that a person is actually regenerated, freed from sin, and reborn as children of God. Which begs the question, do we need to be baptized to be saved? And this is the same kind of question that the Judaizers were asking of Paul and the church in Galatia. Do we need to be circumcised to be saved? Do we need to add something to our faith through grace in our God or in Jesus Christ. And of course, the answer that they come up with is no, you don't need to be circumcised. You don't need to be baptized. It's not a necessary requirement of salvation. It's an obligation. It's a responsibility. Jesus tells us to be baptized, and you'll see that Peter is going to baptize some people here in the book of Acts, but it's not necessary. We know that the thief on the cross, when he asked to be in paradise with Jesus, Jesus didn't say, well, first you have to get baptized, and that's not going to happen because we're dying here on a cross. No, he said, of course you'll be with me. Baptism is a sign of belief. It is not an obligation or necessary for belief. So what's happening here in the New Testament church is at stake is the truth of the gospel. Is there anything that needs to be added to our faith in Jesus Christ, be it baptism or be it circumcision or some work that we need to do that conforms to the oral or the ceremonial laws, including the dietary laws of the Hebrews? Is there something we need to add to our faith in Jesus Christ? And of course, they're going to come out with the answer. It's in faith alone. Solo fide. Faith alone that one is saved. So let's pick up our story in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, where we read these words. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. He calls Peter Cephas here. Jesus gave him the name Petros, the Greek name Petros, which means rock. In Aramaic, in the more common language, it means Cephas. It's the same translation of the rock. He is a circumcised Hebrew believer from Galilee. He's a fisherman. And he comes to Antioch, where Paul has established the first church. Antioch is one of the third largest and most significant cities in the whole Roman Empire. It's the capital of Syria. It's 300 miles northeast of Jerusalem. It's a very important city. It's in modern-day Turkey today. It's known for its culture, its religion. They worship the god Apollo. Because of its significance in the Roman Empire, Paul made it the headquarters of the first church. So he's there in Antioch, and Peter comes up, and Paul tells us that he had to oppose him to his face. These two leaders square off in public. It's one of the most dramatic encounters that we have in the New Testament. It's these two great heavyweights. In this corner, wearing the blue trunks, we have Peter from Galilee. In this corner, we have Paul wearing the white trunks, and he's a Hellenist, and he's a Pharisee, and he comes from Tarsus, and he's been persecuting the church, and they square off. And Paul says, when Peter came, I had to oppose him to his face publicly. I had to condemn him. He stood in the wrong. Well, why? We're going to see that in just a minute, but we know that his actions were not consistent with his belief. He's not the rock here, but Peter is the coward. He's the one that we find in the courtyard on the night of the crucifixion of Jesus. He doesn't stand strong, he stands weak. His actions were not consistent with his belief. He did something that made an addition to the gospel of faith alone in Jesus Christ. Now, before we go any further, let me make a distinction here. Form is related to content. Every action, every form is a reflection of what we believe. Show me what a person does, and I'll tell you what they believe. The old word courtesy comes from the French word court etiquette. When a knight would come before a king in his courtyard, he would come and he would bow before him. And that form, that manner, that gesture expressed the collective social wisdom of the ages. He's showing respect, he's showing honor, he's showing service, he's showing allegiance by that simple move or that simple form of bowing. Form and content are related to each other. Every action is an indication of what I believe. Let me say it this way. Behavior always reflects belief. And this is where Peter gets into a big problem in Antioch with Paul. So here's what happens. We read in chapter 2, verse 12, these words. For before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Before certain men came, who were these certain men? They were the circumcision party. They were the Judaizers. They were trying to add something to the gospel. They were trying to add the Old Testament oral and ceremonial laws. and to any Gentile convert. Remember, we talked about Gentile converts in the Old Testament. There were proselytes. They were called God-fearers, and they had to be circumcised. And so they're saying, well, if you're going to be a Gentile, you convert to the faith in Jesus Christ, then you need to follow the oral and ceremonial laws, certainly the laws of Moses, so you have to be circumcised. Jesus plus something else. Jesus and the law. And it says they came from James. Well, they're trying to use his name. He didn't send them up. James wasn't a Judaizer. They're just using his name. They falsely use his authority. And Paul tells us that Peter, before they came, was eating with the Gentiles. Now, this is a big deal. How does this come about that Peter is eating with Gentiles? Where do we get this? Well, Peter's a Jew, and he knows that Jews do not eat with Gentiles. They don't go into their homes, they don't associate with them, and they certainly don't eat their food. But here Paul's saying he ate with the Gentiles. Now, how did this happen? Well, one of the things that I love about Galatians is that it brings us into the book of Acts. We see these stories lived out in the book of Acts. So here's what happened to Peter. In Acts chapter 10, we find that there's this Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius up in Caesarea. He's a Gentile convert, a God-fearer, and an angel came to him and said, go to Joppa and find Simon Peter and bring him here to your home. So the very next day, Peter is up on a roof, and he's tired, and he's exhausted, and he's sort of in a trance, and he's very, very hungry. And this sheet comes down from heaven, and in the sheet are all kinds of animals. And God says to him, the Spirit says to him, go and kill these animals and eat them. Now, they're unclean animals. No good Hebrew would ever eat an unclean animal. And so Peter says, when he sees the sheet come down, he says, nothing unclean has ever touched my lips. Never has it touched my lips. And the Spirit says again, kill and eat these animals. And Peter says a second time, nothing has ever unclean touched my lips, and nothing ever will unclean touch my lips. And the Spirit says a third time, kill these animals and eat them. And Peter says, absolutely not. I'm a good Hebrew. I do not eat unclean food. It shall never touch my lips. And then the sheet is withdrawn back up into heaven. Well, at that very moment, Peter is observing the dietary laws of the Old Testament. No Jew would ever eat meat that was taken from a killed or a strangled animal, or animals that had shed their blood. It was part of the Orthodox beliefs of the Hebrew people. It's called kosher food. It's what's permitted according to their dietary laws. But in this vision, the Spirit asks him to eat unclean food. 3 times he rejects that when the sheet goes up into heaven. And then he's trying to figure out, now, what does this all mean? What happened? I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm circumcised. And then the Spirit comes, and I see this vision telling me 3 times to eat unclean Gentile food. Well, just at that time, the men arrive from Joppa, from Cornelius, and they tell him to come with us to meet Cornelius. And he goes up with them, and he gets to Cornelius's house, and he has this great breakthrough. And this is Peter now, 17 years after Paul starts his ministry, and he puts the two together. Well, there's a Gentile that's called me, and he's telling me that an angel came to him from God, so I must listen to him. And he invites me into a Gentile home. Now, no good Jew would ever go into a Gentile home, but Peter goes into the home when he arrives. He ignores the fact that it's unlawful according to all of the ceremonial laws of the Hebrews at that time, and he eats of the food of the Gentiles. He has this dramatic breakthrough that he's in a home that he considered to be unclean, and he's eating food that he considered to be unclean. Well, at the end of that time, Cornelius asks him at the end of the meal, and Cornelius invited a bunch of Gentile friends over, Gentile convert friends. Peter says, is there anything I can do for you? And Cornelius says, yes, preach to us the gospel. You knew Jesus. You walked with him for 3 years. You saw him in a resurrected state, so preach the gospel to us. Well, let me read to you what happens next as Peter is in a Gentile home and eating with the Gentiles, an unclean home, eating with unclean people, and he's preaching the gospel to all of these guests that Cornelius had invited to be with them. So we read in Acts chapter 10, verse 44, these words. While Peter was still saying these things, that is, preaching the gospel, the Holy Spirit fell on all who heard the word. And the believers from among the circumcised, that is the Judaizers, who had come with Peter were amazed because the gift of the Holy Spirit was poured out even on the Gentiles. For they were hearing them speaking in tongues and extolling God. Then Peter declared, "Can anyone withhold water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have?" And he commanded them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. And then they asked him to remain for some days. Here we have what we call the Gentile Pentecost. In Acts 2, we have the Pentecost in Jerusalem to the apostles, the Hebrews, the circumcised. And here in Acts 10, we have the Gentile Pentecost, where Peter is preaching the gospel, the Spirit falls upon them. They are filled with the Spirit. They're filled with the gifts of the Spirit. They start speaking in tongues, and Peter immediately has them baptized. This is a dramatic breakthrough in the understanding of the early church, and certainly in Peter's life as well. It changes the whole scope of the mission and the calling of the church. The church is for all of the people of the universe, of the world, not just for the Hebrews. Finally, we have the fulfillment of the Great Commission to go and preach my message to all people at all times and in all places. It settles the question that the gospel is not just for the Hebrews, but it's for all people, and there is nothing to be added to it, including circumcision. We are saved by faith alone. Now, after all of this dramatic event, and Peter putting together the vision that he has of the sheep coming down and eating the unclean food and entering an unclean Gentile's home and preaching the gospel and having this Gentile Pentecost take place. After all this happens, when the Judaizers arrive and they challenge Peter about his conformance to the dietary laws that they had and to circumcision, guess what Peter does? He draws back and separates himself from the Gentiles, fearing the circumcision party. He goes back into his courtyard mode on the night of the betrayal of Jesus. He backs up. When the Judaizers came, Peter begins to wonder, what are they going to think of me eating all of this food, this unclean food, pig and pork? I mean, it's like we're having a barbecue here. And so out of fear, he acted against that which he knew to be true. He intentionally yields to the pressure of the Judaizers. I am breaking the Hebrew dietary laws. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but biblically it has enormous implications. It has to do with the whole question of, is there something that we need to add to the gospel to be saved? Do we need to obey these Old Testament oral and ceremonial laws, these dietary laws? And if we do, it repudiates all of the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross, that there is nothing that we add, there's nothing we can do to that final, glorious, finished work of Jesus on the cross. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As you'll recall, King Nebuchadnezzar had set up this golden image, and he asked the whole nation to worship that image one day when they heard the sound of the marching band that he had gathered together. And so, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people gather on this great plain. He has his golden image out there. The band strikes up, and he expects everyone to bow to this image. Well, everybody does bow, except that Nebuchadnezzar's court officials say, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, can you see way out there in the distance, there are three men who are still standing, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar says, well, bring them here to me. And they bring them forward. And he says, you probably did not understand what I said. I'm going to give you a second chance. The band's going to strike up one more time. Everybody's going to bow. And they said, no, we're not going to worship your idol. We don't worship your image. We only worship our God, the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. That's all we're going to worship him. And Nebuchadnezzar says, well, you see that big fiery furnace over there? I'm going to heat it up 7 times more than it's heated up now, and I'm going to throw you in there if you don't worship my golden image. And they refuse to worship that image. He throws them into the furnace, the three men, and then he says, well, wait a minute. When he looks into the furnace, he said, I thought I threw three men in there, but there's a fourth in there, and it looks like it's the Son of God. And we think it's Jesus, obviously. And so he has them come out of the furnace. The furnace is so hot that it destroys the men who opened the door. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come out, and their hair is not singed. They don't smell like they've been burning. They're in great shape. And Nebuchadnezzar says, well, your God must be the true God. He really must. And so I'm going to command my whole nation to worship your God. Isn't it amazing that one simple act of obedience where hey, if it were me, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying, well, I believe in the God of the Old Testament, but if I'm dead, I can't do any good to anybody. I can't serve them. I can't and share that message. I can't evangelize them. Why don't I just take this little vacation here, this little spiritual vacation, and bow down and worship this image? And just be for a moment. And even when I'm bowing down, I'll be praying to my God. Okay, I'm going to pray to my God. It'll be a spiritual moment for me, and then I'll stand back up. But they didn't. Belief is related to behavior. They could not have a behavior that wasn't consistent with what they believed. And because they did, and because they believed their God saved them, and a whole nation came to the belief in their God. It was a dramatic moment in the Old Testament. They refused to yield to the pressure that would contradict the truth of what they believed. So we read in Galatians chapter 2, verse 13, that Peter's behavior is clearly not aligned with the beliefs that he had and the vision that he had of the sheet coming down from heaven and the experiences that he had with the Gentiles and the Gentile Pentecost. And all of a sudden, he backs down from all that. So Paul writes in Galatians 2:13, and with him, that is with Peter, the rest of the Jews acted insincerely, so that even Barnabas was carried away by their insincerity. The result of his actions is that others followed him and backed down. He took everyone else with him. He was insincere in his faith. And that sounds like a mild term, but he was a hypocrite. The word hypocrite in the Greek means an actor. It says that Peter had just been acting out his true faith, but when it came to the test, he immediately backed down. He was pretending to be one person, but in reality, he's someone else. And if that were not enough, even Barnabas followed him. Barnabas, my trusted servant and fellow minister in Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. Speed of the leader, speed of the team. Even Barnabas went with them. So Peter's behavior here now has enormous implications and an enormous influence on the work that we're trying to do here to the Gentile people. We read further in Galatians chapter 2, verse 14, we read these words. When I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel. There we see that great phrase, the truth of the gospel. I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel these Gentiles to live like Jews? When I saw what was happening, I had heard the rumor, but I wanted to see for myself. And when I arrived and saw that Peter totally backed down and that at stake was the truth of the gospel, justification, salvation by faith alone, not by any dietary law, not by any ceremonial law, not by circumcision, but the truth of the gospel is it's Jesus Christ alone, faith alone. When I saw that, I had to say to him before them all, I had to deal it with him publicly. Peter's sin was public, and I will now demand a public accountability. Peter, the rock, is held accountable by Paul, the apostle, Paulos apostolos. Peter, you ate with the Gentiles. You didn't require them to live like a Jew, and now your actions are implicating them that they must live like a Jew, that they must submit themselves to certain dietary laws and certainly circumcision to really be saved. Peter, you're out of your mind. What are you doing? You know that isn't the truth of the gospel. Now let's dial into this for a moment here, and let's pause, and I'm going to conclude here with a couple comments. One, this is a question, number one, a question of behavior and belief matching our actions. Behavior and belief, form and content. Show me what a person does and I'll show you what they believe. Up to this point, Peter and Paul had been in agreement with the truth of the gospel. There was nothing that needed to be added to the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. But Peter caved under pressure. He wavered. He had a breaking point. Peter had already shown, interestingly, this tendency in his life in the courtyard, where he denied Jesus Christ 3 times, his allegiance to Jesus, his relationship with Jesus. 3 times. So Jesus had to come back after his resurrection and 3 times ask Peter, do you love me? Jesus forgave him for what he did. Jesus understood him. He still called him his rock, his Petros. I will build my church on you, even though you denied me 3 times. What a loving, wonderful God we have. Because we all have wavering points, and we all compromise. And there are times when we need to come before God and confess that compromise, and then change our behavior. Change how we act, not go back into a repeated pattern of cowardice when we back down from the gospel. And it causes us to ask the question, where is our behavior not matching our beliefs? It's that question of form and content. To sweat the small stuff, everything matters to God. Don't cave into pressure. So it's a question of behavior. Secondly, it's a question of influence. People are watching us. They follow us. If he does it, I'll do it. We influence people with our every action. And the question becomes, who are we influencing this very moment in our lives in a very positive way or in negative numbers? How do we influence people by our behavior and by how we live? We know the truth, but is our behavior consistent with that? And then finally, Paul's asking the question of accountability here. Paul is holding Peter accountable. Paul could easily have turned away and not gotten into this confrontation, but he didn't. He knew that his brother in Jesus Christ, who had had these dramatic experiences with Jesus Christ, had lived 3 years with him, had had these visions, had extended the right hand of fellowship, was now compromising his belief and his behavior. And in grace and in love, Paul confronts him. Silence may be golden, but it's not always loving. It's not always being accountable. He holds him accountable. And I wonder, are there people that we need to go to and speak to that we see are going down the wrong road this very moment, and God might be using us in grace and in love without judgment? We don't build someone up by tearing them down, by building them up, by coming to them and saying, hey, you know, I've noticed over time that your behavior is not really consistent with what you believe, and it's influencing other people. And I'm just praying that God is using me as his instrument to speak to you at this particular point in your life. Or maybe there's someone that needs to come to me and speak into my life where my behavior is not consistent with my beliefs. Some of the best times I've had in my life are when godly people who I've known for long periods of time have come to me and said, Stu, you need a course correction here. You need to recalibrate. Your life is not living up to the standard that Jesus Christ has set for us. So it's a question of behavior here. Our behavior is to be consistent with our beliefs. Our behavior influences other people. And when we see those around us that we love and care for, and their behavior is not consistent, there is a time when we need to step up and have those difficult, hard discussions with them that are filled with grace and love. So this is the story of Peter. And this is the story of his great breakthrough, because now Peter goes on to do great things for the kingdom of God.